Hello students, this particular module will talk about the language debate in India. The learning objectives of this module are 4 in number, and firstly the objective is to understand the language question in the context of a multicultural nation like India. The second objective is to elaborate the issues that arose around the question of adoption of Hindi as a national language of India. The third objective is to understand the role of language in fueling social conflicts in the nation, and the fourth objective is to examine the importance of the language question in creating a dual system of education and intensifying intra-elite conflicts in politics. India is, as you know, is one of the most linguistically diverse countries of the world. It is almost impossible to count the total number of languages, mother tongue, dialects and speech varieties spoken throughout the country. This enormous diversity of languages was thought to be inimical to the creation of a nation, to the sustenance and creation of a nation, and it was thought that this linguistic diversity might even lead to the breakup of the nation. However, we have seen that in the subsequent period, this rich diversity in language has come to be celebrated and understood as an integral dimension of the nation's multicultural ethos. The language debate in India is not new. In fact, it is quite old, and it is tied to the idea of India as a nation. In the Constituent Assembly debates, which began in the 1949, the language issue was debated passionately, and the three issues around which the language question inhered was the name of the nation or the country, second the national anthem, and the third was the national language. What the political leaders were decided about was that English as a language should be dislodged, because English was the language of the colonizers, and without English being dislodged, the national movement could not gather steam. So, therefore, all English evolved as a language of judiciary, administration and education all across the country, but there was a popular feeling that English needs to be displaced from this place of importance in the minds of the people, and hence the process was fraught with a lot of challenges. The term language question basically refers to the politics around the question of language and the multiple domains that this politics affects. It is also the result of a tangible and a political outcome of a certain kind. Now, the linguistic reorganization of states took place in 1956, but along with this during the time of linguistic reorganization, what was also debated about was the status of regional languages. An example is interesting. In the Constituent Assembly debates, Paramjit Singh Judge points out that for the first time the issue of Rajasthani as a language was also discussed. Rajasthani was supposed to be full of valor and full of heroism, and therefore the question of why Rajasthani should not be included as an aspect of regional language was debated, and Judge mentions that this was the first time that led to the birth of regional politics in the debates, from the debates of the Constitution. But one important thing that we always recognize is that just as there have been debates around communalism, casteism, secularism, nationalism in our country, the question of language has not received a similar kind of attention from the social scientists, and intellectuals in our country. But according to Judge, the language issue in India overrides and has overridden all other divisions based on ideology at the empirical level. Therefore, we need to give attention to the question of language. Let us come to the question of why should we talk about language? Why should we study the language debate? There are three important aspects of the language debate because of which we should understand the language debate closely. Language shapes it's not only an aspect of social existence, it also shapes and expresses our vision of this world. So, the first aspect why language should be studied is that it is not only a social institution that unites people, it also divides people. It is not only a means of communication, but it is also a means of incommunication. So, therefore, people do not use language in the same way. The lines of division, differentiation, competition are witnessed even internally within particular language users themselves. So, therefore, language offers certain capabilities on people. Their absence denotes the lack of capabilities. So, therefore, we need to understand the language, the internal politics of a language very carefully in a nuanced fashion. The second dimension why language should be studied is that language is related to group rights and community identities. Language provides a sense of belongingness to communities. In fact, the nation state is considered to be a linguistic community itself, but in the Indian context, it is difficult to imagine the Indian nation in a singular fashion as consisting of only one language. So, therefore, thus the language issue brings about a question of rights, representations, resources of speakers, and hence you have linguistic minorities, you have dominant and minority languages, and hence the relationship between the dominant and the minority languages is a matter which is worth noting. The third reason why we should study the language question is that the language issue is the source of, since India, there have been several attempts to map India's languages through its censors, through its gazetteers, through its linguistic survey reports, etc. And we find that there are even languages which have only 10,000 speakers or even less than 10,000 speakers. So, there are scheduled languages and there are non-scheduled languages. It is because of cultural homogenization that the non-scheduled languages, language with fewer speakers, are losing out the language. There is a rapid decline of linguistic diversity in India. For example, tribal languages and Andamanese languages have to be specially mentioned in this regard. In other words, what language we learn, what language we choose to speak in, it is a decision that we make based on questions of power, questions of identity, questions of solidarity that individuals and communities feel about a particular language. Now, let me go to talking about what was how is language linked to social conflicts. In multicultural societies like India, language has played a very important role in creating divisions along multiple lines, and it is a source of identity-based politics of people. The foremost grievance, one of the foremost grievance that is expressed in the context of India is that the language policy has been implemented in a half-hearted manner, and this has resulted in a dual system of schooling. What is this dual system of schooling? This is a system of schooling whereby those who can afford to educate their children in private schools where English is a medium of instruction belong to a particular category, and those who cannot afford and send their children to government schools where the medium of instruction and instruction is in mother tongue, where regional language is the medium of instruction, constitute another category. All the government run and municipal schools in the state are included in the second category, while the former system is represented by the private schools. Now, in private schools where English is the medium of instruction, students are encouraged not to speak in mother tongue, even amongst themselves, while in the case of the government run schools, the dependence on mother tongue is absolutely total, and here the English is not imparted as in a proper manner. That is the grievance that people express. The latter schools, that is the government run schools or the schools where the masses go, majority of parents do not have much of an alternative but to send their children to these government run schools. Now, this dual system of schooling has resulted in a class divide, and it has caused mutual antagonism amongst people in society. Those who are educated in the regional language, they feel that if they do not get their children educated in English, they would lose out. They consider those whose children are educated in English as elitist, and this dual system of schooling is responsible for sustaining the dominance of English in our public life. Those who are educated in English, they feel that they uphold national interest. They are self-proclaimed nation builders who work for national interest. They support English, they vocalize their support for English, and they claim to promote national integration. In fact, those who do not support such logic, those who support regional language, mother tongue based education are in fact regarded as ridden with obscurantism, traditionalism and regionalism by those who study in English. This leads to a kind of a division, class division between two groups of people, those who symbolize India and those who symbolize Bharat. Now, according to D.L. Sheth, the language policy has emerged as a political discourse where the question of language is linked to a question of power between two elite groups. These two elite groups are entrenched in the Indian mainstream power politics, whereas there are on one side the English educated elites, on the other side the newly ascendant regional elites who have emerged on the national scene, but who do not have English education. Now, the former group, that is the English educated in English, the elites educated in English, they have monopolized power in terms of political discourse, and they have strengthened their position in the bureaucracy, in power politics, whereas the latter group, that is the regional elite, they came to wield power much later over a period of time at the regional level. Now, they are trying to create a space at the national level. The numerical elite, the power of numbers of the regional elite gives them the strength and the self-confidence to claim positions at the national level. For an important basis of demarcation of these two elite groups is the use of language and the preeminence given to English by each of these groups. For the former, English is most important, while its importance is marginal for the latter group. As I had mentioned earlier, the division between India and Bharat symbolizes groups which during the Nehruvian period and after, they used the social capital which included the linguistic competence and expertise to establish hegemony by arrogating to themselves the control over political discourse due to modernization and development. It was due to modernization and development that those who were reluctant to embrace this discourse did not have the linguistic capital and were considered to be relatively underdeveloped. Now, these relatively underdeveloped people adopted a few measures for themselves. For example, they were open to technology. They adapted themselves to technology to develop themselves. But the ideas of secularism, modernization, socialism were couched in such a language that it did not have any link with their lives. Thus, modernization became an elite discourse and was largely carried out in English, where these people, the regional elites and people from the regions, did not have a space. The association of English with modernity automatically reduced the importance of indigenous languages as a medium of instruction, and often indigenous languages were considered to be backward, they were considered to be traditional and in need of reform. Now, it took over a decade for the marginalized groups to oppose this kind of a patron-client relationship that they experienced in politics and to claim a role as citizens in the polity. During the 1960s and the 70s, when regional parties emerged and caste class differences assumed a lot of importance, a lot of political salience, these groups became important. People who patronized these groups, who joined these groups, became important, and they had an influence in shaping the electoral and party politics. The balance of power was considerably altered when the Congress system could not withstand or could not accommodate the power of the people, the politics of the people, and it gave way to the ascendance of the regional parties, which then brought in a number of these people of Shudra castes onto the center stage of politics. So, you have the rise of the Bahujan Samaj Party by Kashiram and Mayawati, which is a step in this direction. Therefore, as I had started out earlier by saying that the intra-elite conflict in Indian society also has a linguistic aspects. In the current times, the increasing power and heft of the regional elite in different states merely indicates that forces of democratization have been unfolding in different parts of the country. Now, let us talk a little bit about language, politics and democracy in India. The question of national language is a very political issue, and it became a political issue right from the time of the period of independence. Linguistic movements and assertions made by them have become very, very important because they have expanded the meaning of democracy, the practices of democracy in our country, and therefore we need to engage with the linguistic movements when we are concerning ourselves with language and democracy in India. Now, when we talk of the question of the national language, we know about the Constituent Assembly debates and how passionately the leaders debated about what should be our national language. But closely aligned to this debate on national language was the question of Hindi and Urdu, the division between Hindi and Urdu, which came about in the first decades of independence. India witnessed a number of linguistic riots. There was linguistic reorganization of states, this clash between supporters of Hindi, and there was this demand for doing away with the imposition of the national language, especially from the speakers of Tamil and other South Indian states. Now, the linguistic reorganization of states, though it occurred, it did not resolve the issue, as is evident in the rise of the linguistic movements in Assam during the 1970s, in Maharashtra during the 1960s, and the demands for the recognition of Maithili thereafter. In the recent years, the National Education Policy 2020 again raises the question of education in mother tongue, in regional language, and also talks about Hindi being made mandatory across the country, which has stirred up passion around the language debate. The way in which the linguistic economy has evolved in India in the post-independence period has created a regional hierarchy and gradation of languages and dialects. Now, at the highest level, we have the English-speaking elite, followed by those who speak the vernacular and English and know another language very well, that is a trilingual elite, and those who do not know either of these language but their dialects. Now, this last group of people who constitute a large majority, they use minor and non-scheduled languages to assert their demands and make sense of ideas like Swaraj, nation, etc. As far as the national language is concerned, since Hindi is the national language, it occupies the imaginary of the nation, and therefore these minor non-scheduled languages in our country, which are not part of the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution, there are quite a few, namely Bhojpuri, Awadhi, Khadi Boli, Braj, Tulu, etc., Bodo. These languages are not promoted. And when one talks of assertion of demands in these languages or demanding for the recognition of these languages, they are considered to be parochial. They are considered to be an impediment to the growth of Hindi. It is considered that they should be, such demands should be controlled. Now, automatically what comes to our mind is, what is the importance of Hindi? Why does Hindi have such a pride of place in our national imagination? Now, statistically, one would think that Hindi is most widely spoken, and it's quite true that Hindi is considered to be a spoken language which is spoken widely, and most widely in fact in India. Therefore, in the national education policy from class 1 onwards, the government is proposing or has proposed that 3 languages should be learnt by children, and it would contribute to the cognitive development and the national development, national integration and cognitive development. Now, the championing of Hindi as integral to the 3 language formula is, after all, about who belongs to this nation or who gets to belong. This language is neither richer nor more scientific or authentic than any other language to merit this status. In fact, scholars have shown that Hindi is none of these things. Moreover, the Hindi that is spoken has important political implications, namely it is more Sanskritic, it is more Hindu, it is more upper caste, and the desire to push Hindi is about creating a particular identity and power that the government desires. So, the shared cultural history of Hindi and Urdu have been ignored and forgotten. In fact, the language that was spoken in the northern heartland was Hindustani, and it contained a mixture of Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit languages. But what happened is, after independence, when Pakistan was also formed, formation of Pakistan and the question of Urdu being the national language of Pakistan had an impact on the way in which we started thinking about a national language, or rather our leaders started thinking about the national language. So, therefore, Urdu was typecast as Muslim, Muslims were considered a minority, and Hindi was purged of the Arabic and the Persian words that were already there and was made more Sanskritic. So, therefore, the dominance of the standardized form of Hindi has an effect on all other linguistic cultures, namely Awadhi, Braj, Khadi Boli, Urdu, etc. Therefore, the national language policy says that if the influences of these languages can be included in Hindi, but it also feels, it also advocates that Hindi is a language whereas all the others are dialects. Let me conclude the language debate by talking about the main points. So, the language debate, as we have articulated during this time, deals with the question of why is language certain important aspect of our culture. It also spoke about how the question of language is much more complex because it is linked to individual and community rights, it is linked to resources and forms of belonging in a multilingual nation. Though it is felt that a multilingual nation is useful and better for national integration, the language debate shows that there are hierarchies and fault lines in our society around the same issue. Therefore, national integration, we must realize, cannot be just the ability to casually speak other languages. We must also have the ability to listen to each other without prejudice. Further, the internal hierarchies and the dynamics of a linguistic community is as important to note as the relation between the speakers of different languages within a nation. Being aware and sensitive to different aspects of the language question will also give us an understanding of ourself and community and what holds us together as a nation.